save the questions to the end of each segment. The session is also being recorded, and so you will all be sent a copy of the recording in a couple days after the session. So no worries about trying to write it all down, the good stuff. For those of you who are new to AFCEA and may not know AFCEA, just a little bit about us. We are an international organization. Of course, this is the Ottawa, Canada branch, and we're entirely run by volunteers. We hold monthly professional development events and also some other intermittent ones. We have been running a 5-day IT security course for a little over 30 years, and this is a bit of an offshoot of that. And John will talk a bit about that as well. So our next virtual event, and as with everyone else, all our events are virtual right now. Our next professional development luncheon is January 12th, and Colonel Robin Houlihan, Canadian lead of the NORAD Pathfinder team, is going to be talking to us about all the great things they've been doing, including what they've learned and done with AI, with cloud. And so that should be quite informative, and that will be January 12th, and the registration link for that will go out shortly. The February event is still to be announced. And of course, every year we try to do our golf tournament. We missed it last year thanks to COVID, but we are definitely hoping that we'll be able to do it in May. And that always benefits a charity such as Soldiers On, Homeless Veterans, Wounded Warrior. So it is a very important and near and dear event to us. Lastly, for announcements, I would like to thank our sponsor that helped make all of this happen this week, which is Microsoft Canada, specifically John Weigelt, who is the National Technology Officer for Microsoft Canada. And John, would you like to say a few words?
Sure thing. Hi, everyone. Great to be here at day 2. We had a very, very well-received day 1, where we provided kind of those foundations for security assessment and authorization, and then started to delve into what's happening around hyperscale cloud services and cloud services in general. Today, we'll take that conversation further and talk really about the different models for cloud, some of the legal agreements. We'll talk about some of those tips and tricks around SA&A, and then we'll talk about operationalization of the cloud type of environment and some of those lessons learned. So exciting day 2 that's here, and we really appreciate AFCEA for hosting this for us.
Thank you so much, John. All right, as John mentioned, this is a 3-day event. So yesterday was day 1. We covered foundations and some of the hyperscale cloud concepts. Today, we're going to be covering compliance, regulatory impacts, responsibilities for cloud, and SA&A specifically for hyperscale cloud. We have 2 speakers today, and we will have time for questions after each one. Excuse me. And our first speaker today is Jonathan Hay from Oracle. And I'm going to ask Jonathan if he'll say a few words about himself and do his introduction for us. Jonathan, are you online?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you. And if you want to take over sharing your slide deck, that would be awesome.
Yeah, let me just share my screen.
Well, Jonathan's doing that. I should also remind folks that tomorrow is day 3, and tomorrow we have a bit of a longer session. I think it is 2 hours in total, and we have 3 amazing practitioners who will be joining us from CMHC, TBS, and ESDC. We're going to be sharing with us their own journeys on cloud and lessons learned, what worked, what didn't work, their aha moments, all of this great information they'll be sharing with us tomorrow.
Kelly, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen. Fabulous.
So I first would like to start off by thanking you for having me today, and thank to AFCEA for letting us talk today. I am Jonathan Hay. I'm the Customer Engagement Lead at Oracle Cloud Infrastructure. And essentially that means I help customers get through all their compliance security questions so they can be on the cloud. I have a variety of experience working as cloud providers, but also on the other end of being part of assessing cloud providers. And today, what I would like to go through is how we use international certifications and other methods to assess compliance within the cloud.
Jonathan, sorry to interrupt, but if you could sit maybe a little closer to your microphone, it's a little muffled.
Thank you for letting me know. Let me try. All right, let me know if this is better. If not, I could always try something else.
It's about the same.
How is this?
Oh, that's better.
It was on the wrong microphone. So I just fixed the settings in Teams. So let me go through the agenda that for today. I wanted to do a quick walkthrough over different cloud computing models, talking about SaaS, PaaS, and IaaS, and shared responsibility, and this setting the stage for talking about the international compliance certifications and how they can be used for SAA. And I also want to go through provider different agreements that you should be aware of when using cloud providers, and also just some common myths that I've been hearing and debunking them around using a CSP. So this is kind of good dovetailing off what Mark was talking about yesterday with the different types of offerings you can have from a cloud provider. But in order to talk about compliance, it's very important to make sure to understand the difference of what you are using the cloud provider for, as it's going to impact the responsibility model, how you perform SAA, understand certifications, and utilize that information for your own risk analysis. So I don't want to spend too much time going through this, but I just wanted to hit on that you have the SaaS, PaaS, and IaaS, where you're either using a software as a service, which is going to provide you pretty much across the board everything that you need, and the cloud provider will have more responsibility, versus PaaS, which is a platform that allows you to develop on top of the application, but doesn't manage the entire stack, into IaaS, which is really giving you compute and storage type of resources. And Mark talked about this yesterday as how hyperscale, they scale within the different models. But in order to understand compliance, we really have to know what is the CSP's responsibility versus the customer responsibility. Because as you go through SNA and you review these reports, you're going to see customers responsible for X and Y. And for an example, when you're looking at IaaS, the network, the infrastructure, I mean, some of the things around cloud providers is their bread and butter is understanding and running data centers, providing security, doing this on a massive scale. And that is one of the biggest benefits that the cloud providers are bringing, but you have to understand that patching on the operating system, running the application, ensuring the data is encrypted and security controls are on there. CSPs will provide you with best practices, but when you go through SAA, you're going through audits, regulatory, any other type of reviews, that's going to be the customer's responsibility versus the CSP responsibility. And as you go through and review the different reports, this is going to be called out, so you can ensure that you put all these controls in place. So one of the areas that I really want to focus on in today's session is different type of compliance reports. One of the things that we talked about yesterday was how cloud providers, they automate and they scale. At the same time, compliance and security, they also are trying to scale that as a way to support all their customers. Cloud providers can't go through answering every single question for every customer, it's not efficient. And in one of the ways that they do scale is by having these certifications. Here are just a few of international certifications when you go through a review different cloud providers. And I'm going to talk about what you should do with these and how to review them. But keep in mind, this is just a small amount. These are some of the major global ones, but at the same time, there are regional certifications. PBMM is an example. If you're talking about Germany, there's C5, which is a very detailed one. Every country has their own compliance certifications. And one of the things that cloud providers do is they're performing these controls on a large scale basis. They're not doing anything that is regional specific, country specific, because one of the main ways a hyperscale cloud works is be able to do the same process across the board and make sure that there's efficiencies and that they can scale. So as you're reviewing SA&A, the best place to start is understanding these different types of certifications and controls and see how they apply to the SA&A controls. Because that type of mapping could provide that assurance without going through and deep diving into each one, looking at what type of documentation is required, because it's very lengthy. It could take a lot of time, and everyone wants to just make sure that these controls are in place. So what I wanted to do is you get these reports from the cloud providers. What do you do with them? How do you review them? In my mind, I like to always start with the SOC 2 report, as I find that is one of the most detailed, talks about all the different processes, talks about the services, and you really could get a great understanding of the security posture of a cloud service provider. So whenever you are receiving these type of reports, these are the different steps that I suggest that anyone goes through. First thing is understanding the reporting period as to the timeline that you're reviewing these reports, making sure you don't have an older report that is current and that is satisfying your needs. So you're actually reviewing something that's up to date. And understanding the services and locations of the reports. These compliance reports, they're usually specific to some service within the CSP. Not all services are always covered. There are new services that may not have been reviewed yet. There could be legacy services. If you are using a service that's not in one of these reports, maybe not part of PBMM, there could be some differences that going through your SA&A may not apply or may be different. So making sure that that's in scope for this report, for these different type of reports and certifications. And if there's a service that's not in scope and maybe it's in scope for another audit, that's when you should reach out, ask questions, talk to the service provider, and they'll provide you details as to why or it is covered one area and not the other. Then the next area is understanding controls. The SOC report is a very detailed write-up. When you talk about different items like FedRAMP, ISO, it goes through details of what is the control, how it was tested, what is covered, and what was performed, because that is the only way to make sure that the mapping is correct and it's reaching the level. Different certifications may go to different depth within some areas. PCI is a little heavier on the penetration testing. SOC 2 it goes a little more within processes, availability and privacy. FedRAMP pretty much covers everything across the board, but as talking about locations, it may not go. Data center specific controls may be different within the US or within other regions, because those may not be covered under FedRAMP. So it's good to understand the level of depth of the controls, and that goes with the testing methodology of what was done by that third party to do these controls. The next area is deficiencies. There could be certain areas called out, making sure that any type of deficiencies called out, what was done as mitigating actions. Is this something that would affect your environment? Is that deficiency, maybe it was just a one-time thing that was covered and they did their due diligence to make sure there was no impact to it, but it's still called out to let you know that that happened. It's good to understand the impact of them and to see how that affects your environment. And the last, as we just hit on before, is the customer responsibility. I'm probably will hit on this a few different times to understand what's the cloud providers, what's shared, what's the customers, because if this is not in place, what is being stated in some of these testations may not be valid if you're not doing your part of it. SOC is very detailed to understand the user consideration controls of what the customer has to do. ISO usually also calls out what is different between shared and the customer environment, and same as FedRAMP, what uses the NIST framework that calls out what has to be done by the customer. So looking at all of these, and this would probably be familiar if you look through all the different domains within SANA, and what I usually talk with different customers about is what it really comes down to are these different type of domains. And these are standard across the board between a lot of these different certifications. But this is, to me, the meat of what you are trying to assess. When you're going through and you're looking at cloud providers, you want to make sure that all of these different domains are being covered. And I want to talk about a few of these. I mean, I think each one of these could be its own session almost of how you're going to go through, assess, making sure that these are up to the standards that you expect. But some of them I want to hit on is physical security or data center security, as it's called on this slide. And this is one of the probably the main areas of concern, is making sure, how do we know that no one's going into the data centers? And how do we know that our servers are secure? I mean, probably the main way to secure data is making sure that no one can actually tamper or touch your servers. And this is one of the main foundations of hyperscale cloud, is this is what they do to make sure that the data centers, usually addresses are hidden where they're not given out. So even no one knows where the data centers are actually occurring with the physical address. There's proper personnel screening. They understand everyone going in and out of the data centers. I've worked within cloud and also within other industries where they've ran their own data centers, and the type of security you see within the cloud environments are just at another level, because this is what they do day in and day out. And this is something you'll see defined within these different compliance reports. And another area just to hit on is around even data security, talking about the different encryptions and how the key management and how they're stored, utilizing these HSMs that are usually, that should be FIPS enabled so that your keys are stored. Having these type of controls and depth within and being reviewed by these third-party auditors will map directly to the SANA, and making sure that those processes are in place so it could meet whatever type of internal requirements or obligations that you have. And just the last two that usually come through is, one is change management. These processes are set up across the board, all services, and that there are proper reviews to ensure that any changes to services, to code, are pushed out, reviewed, are done on, as we talked about yesterday, the different levels. Mark hit on, when you're going through different cloud providers, there is the control plane, so that it's the data you are putting into these services are segregated for any type of changes to any services used by a cloud provider. And that these are defined and performed across the board. And then the last area is access, right? Everyone wants to make sure that the access controls are in place. And this is an area which is also usually shared between the customer and also the cloud provider. Cloud provider making sure that they have access managers in place, providing guidance of how you can put in the proper access management. So wanted to hit on some of these areas that you should see within all these reports. And one maybe is not in depth on one compliance report to SOC. Look at ISO, look at FedRAMP, look at PCI, and that should provide you with the details and due diligence that are done by these cloud providers. And the best part is the review by a third party. So you're getting a non-biased opinion as to making sure that these are done to the level, and these map pretty much directly to all different domains within any type of security assessment that you are performing. So another area when assessing cloud providers is understanding the provider agreements. Every cloud provider, they may have different terms for these agreements, but I've tried to make it a little more broad so they hit within these certain areas. And I just want to just touch slightly on each different ones. If there are any questions on any of them, please let me know. We could dive a little more into them. But I think one of the most important ones to me is the privacy policy. And the reason why I really want to call this for the privacy policy is this may be hit on in some of the compliance programs, but some of this may be a little more broad, but a little more different as to what is done with your data. Making sure that the proper data residency controls where your data lives. At the same time, this impacts everything with GDPR and data rights. How are those going to be supported? There are a lot of privacy policies that may not be on the cloud provider, but may sit on the customer, but you have to impact the cloud provider. So if the customer asks to request for their data to be deleted, how is that process actually done? How does that go through? What is in place? So all of that will be within the privacy policy. Hosting policies, that would hit on different type of security measures within the cloud provider. May not be as in depth as different compliance reports, but it will give you assurance as to what is the cloud provider saying, how the data is going to be hosted. I also put in data deletion. This is a lot of times within the hosting policy, but how you can have interoperability between different cloud providers, how you can move your data, extract your data, delete your data if you decide to leave the cloud provider. These are all great to understand and know before signing on, making sure that these are in line to your expectations. Security policy usually is that provides overall how the infrastructure is secured, or if we talk about even PaaS or IaaS, it may be a little more in depth of how the security models are designed for those different services. And audit rights is something extremely important. I mean, especially, I know a lot of regulations understand making sure you have the right audit rights for your cloud provider. If something happens, if there's a breach, what can you do? Making sure you can go through and work with your cloud provider to dive into and understand the auditing that is required. Performing yearly audits, either through a questionnaire, talking through the different compliance reports, or maybe there's certain areas that you feel are not covered as much, and making sure that it meets your level of satisfaction, ensuring that is in place. And for the last area I want to talk about is subcontractors. There could be colo providers, there could be other third parties that they may be using to host your data or be running services. It's understanding that lineage and that responsibility model throughout. Every different type of service and cloud provider may be using some contractors differently, and making sure those rights are there or even flow through. I mean, some audit rights should be able to flow through to the subcontractors, so you have the right assurance that you need and understanding everything where your data is going. So one of the areas I also was asked to go through is, let's go through and debunk some of these myths about the cloud. I put in some here. There are plenty more areas that we really could dive into, but I just thought these are some common questions and concerns that I have seen from customers, or I've actually kind of had myself in the past. So the first is cloud is just about reducing cost, saving money. But it's not really. As you kind of think about what these cloud providers are doing, especially hyperscale cloud, is they will be able to do this on an efficient level. I mean, this is going down to cloud providers. First, they are providing power in environmental conscious way. They're providing efficiencies within their processes. So you are able to scale up, scale down, use resources as needed. The services from cloud providers are also helping customers so they don't have to create some of these products, and makes it easier to develop and improve the DevOps processes. So there is a lot more when you're going to look at cloud providers than just the dollars and cents of understanding what are the benefits of using the cloud. This second area is cloud is for everything. Let's just move everything to cloud. And that's not always necessarily true. This is about understanding your risk appetite, how your environment's working, using maybe moving some critical applications to the cloud. Some you want to keep on premise. Some legacy applications sometimes are better actually be on premise than the cloud. Some work better on the cloud than on premise. So it's really understanding the infrastructure, your processes, how all your systems interface with each other to determine what is best to be moved to the cloud versus keeping on premise. And third, security. I mean, I hear all the time, but if it's on-prem, we see the box, it's more secure, we have access to it. Most companies, their security organizations are a handful of individuals. Cloud providers, I mean, they have in large security organizations that are they're specialized within cloud and security. And this is pretty much one of the main reasons that you're going to get more comfort with using these with cloud providers. They have dedicated security personnel monitoring their SOC operations 24/7, and the detection and mechanisms that they were able to put in from a large-scale organization is providing additional security than most customers can provide on their own, and that is some of the benefits that you're getting to the cloud. Fourth one is data access. So if our data is within the cloud, they can view our data, do whatever they want to their data. And I think as customers really understand more on the security models, and this is probably going to go through a lot of the questions on SA, probably around key management and encryption. Cloud providers are doing this at a scale. They're not focused on any type of data within that they are hosting. Keep in mind, this is different for its customer responsibility model. If there are SaaS managed applications, this can be a little different between if they do have access to their data or what they're doing for these, how they're hosting these applications. But I would say specifically for IaaS and PaaS, if you put the right encryption in place and you can even hold your own key and provide your own key to these different cloud providers, you're in charge of it. You're the one securing and making sure that only you have access to your data. The fifth one is, okay, we're with one cloud provider, we're locked in. It's too hard to move to cloud providers, or we can't use multiple cloud providers. What I am seeing in working with customers, they're using multiple cloud providers, reducing risk across the board. Using AWS, Azure, Oracle, Google, putting different applications on them, all the different cloud applications, they're now able to talk together. There are services, so these are easier to do. At the same time, you could always, as I talked about with the hosting clauses, if you could always move providers, or you're not locked into a single cloud provider. You should be able to use the cloud provider that fits your needs the best and has all the security compliance requirements that you feel comfortable with for your risk appetite. And the last area is audit rates. It mentioned that you can't audit the cloud. They just do their thing, and that's what we have to accept. But that's not true. You should be able to ask any questions that you want, perform your in-depth risk assessment, making sure that you are comfortable with the security and compliance within the cloud. I mean, I would say you first do your own due diligence. I know most cloud providers are externalizing their information. They're externalizing their policies, their different agreements, making sure that you have access to their compliance reports. Review all that first, do your homework, but you can always audit, ask questions, making sure that your areas concerned are being covered and you're comfortable with your cloud provider. So these were the areas that I wanted to cover today, but I would like to open this up to see if anyone has any questions.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. It does provide a great deal of insight into the various papers and materials that are available, as well as the models. One question in the stream. Can you speak to the concept of geofencing, or as in, will my data stay in Canada?
Yes, so this is one of the areas within your different agreements and providers that you should make sure are in place. Because I mean, data residency, I understand with Canada, PBM, is one of the areas that we were also, this is a critical. If you don't want your data to be moved, you want to make sure that your data stays within Canada. One of the things I want to hit on again is understanding what type of application you're using. This could make a difference if it's managed or if it's just like an IaaS and PaaS, but it's understanding where the data centers are hosted, that data is never moved by the cloud provider. You select the location where it is, and that data is there, and the cloud provider should give you transparency that your data is being kept within Canada. So as you understand their infrastructure, architecture, and agreements, that should provide you with assurance that the data will not be moved outside of where you select the data within either the region, the data center. Every cloud provider has different types of terms, but the data should never be moved by the cloud provider unless they get your consent to move the data.
Thanks, Jonathan. Any other questions from our audience?
Do we have one more?
There's a question about, are there cloud service providers that have a problem sharing their certification data, as in SOC 2, et cetera?
They shouldn't. I mean, the reason they come up with those reports is to share them with customers. I do know through my experience, worked at some other cloud providers as well, you do probably need to have an NDA in place. There could be something that you have to sign, making sure that you will not share that, especially I would say the SOC report has confidential information. But to me, if they will not prove that they have the certifications or share the certifications, that could be a red flag.
And to follow up to that question, when you talk about SOC 2, is that SOC 2 Type 2?
Yes, so that's a SOC 2 Type 2. There within the SOC report, right? There's SOC 1, SOC 2, SOC 3. Usually the SOC 3 you can get without the NDA. SOC 1 is around financial controls. I usually go for the SOC 2 Type 2 because that provides the testing level of everything that is done, and that's the one that I would request, either the SOC 1 Type 2 or the SOC 2 Type 2 type of reports.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you.
Excellent. All right, moving on to our next session. Thank you so much, Jonathan. We actually have two speakers in our next segment, which is SA for Hyperscale Cloud. We have John Weigelt from Microsoft, and we also have Joe Cummings. So we're going to start with John. So John, if you would share your screen and introduce yourself.
Certainly, happy to introduce myself. Screen sharing. Does it come up yet?
Yeah, it's
Yes.
Awesome. So hi, everyone. I'm John Weigelt. I'm Chief Technology Officer for Microsoft here in Canada. And amongst other things, I'm accountable for compliance of Microsoft's Canadian data centers. And so I've been working to get our cloud services certified here in Canada, as well as helping organizations go through that certification process. So I've just, if I see me looking across to another screen, I'm just making sure that I'm in the right place to be able to switch my slides. And so some great news that's there around certification of the Canadian, of the SA process for cloud services is that the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity has published a wealth of guidance around the certification processes, what they do for assessments, how they look at cloud characterization, and all these materials are available relatively freely for download. And this is a quite recent phenomenon because prior the pre-BMM certification was only available directly from Treasury Board. You could not download it to see what those control sets are. And so you'll see a lot of familiar pieces within that cloud SA guidance. Yesterday, JF went through the security assessment and authorization process and how it's outlined by the ITSG Cloud IT Risk Management Standard. And here you can see those pieces that fit within that cloud assessment framework and what are those things that you need to consider. I myself like Treasury Board's guidance. It's a little bit more streamlined, a little bit more straightforward. I think from a conceptual basis, all those charts. I don't know if you've looked at the harmonized TRA guidance lately, but that thing is thick, and the number of charts and slides in there can be challenging, especially when you look to have senior leadership understand what needs to be done. But I like these 4 appropriate stages. Categorize the data that you're dealing with, look at the security controls, assess those cloud services, and then continuously monitor your service and maintain that authorization. And so I think that's exceptionally useful as a framework. And when we talk to organizations that have gone through this process of being able to do their security assessment and authorization, they've taken this streamlined approach, really emphasizing their concept of operations and then their security requirements traceability. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. It should be noted that the Government of Canada's certification guidance, their assessment process is upon international standards, and there's a ton of reuse here. And if there's one thing that we can reinforce between the communities is that, look, there's a lot of repeatability out with these tool sets. So has its heritage in ITSG 33, which is based upon the NIST 800-53 standards. And so you're able to see that there's some crosswalks that are able to be done across these various tool sets and various certification regimes. When you're looking at the security characterization and categorization of cloud services, now available on the CCCS website are the control profiles for medium as well as low for use within the Government of Canada environment. And the really great news is that there is very tight alignment between the control frameworks and fabrics that the GOC has developed, as well as FedRAMP. Many of the controls, it's simply doing a translation between NIST-approved cryptography and CCCS-approved cryptography. And so, when you double-click on that approval process, you'll find that Advanced Encryption Standard 256 is the common root of that approved cryptography. So you'll find a ton of reuse there. What Canada has done a little bit differently is they've included about a dozen or so controls that talk about software development lifecycle. And so they really look at the heritage of how that cloud service provider develops their tools and their software. Now, you saw in Jonathan's presentation this discussion around different certifications. And if we look at the top of this slide, you'll have a number of certifications that cloud service providers may attain. And at the bottom, you have those CCCS controls. The great news is that there's a tremendous amount of overlap between the controls. I know for ourselves, when we look at building out our control profile, we have a master control set that we track, and we simply map them against these various different control fabrics. And so the same control gets audited in a variety of ways. So there'll be one day when we have an ISO audit coming through, they'll be looking at policies, practices, procedures. The next day, it might be the SOC 2 auditors that come through. And the third day, it might be coming through and looking at the FedRAMP auditors. And so there's a great deal of alignment between these controls. As a security practitioner, I think there's an important note that when we look at these types of control frameworks, we need to recognize that they're information security management systems controls. So they're looking at configuration management, release control. How do you manage administrator access to these tool sets? These are consistent throughout the life cycle of those tool sets. And in many cases, we've seen the control fabrics not really keep pace with the way of hyperscale cloud moving. So for example, when you consider SOC and bridge letters and see material changes to the environment, they tend to look at an outsourced type model for delivery of those services, single tenant, single application. In the cloud environment, if you're doing things at scale and developing on a continuous basis, fitting with the information system, secure management system, you have some abilities to have provisional approvals before they actually make it into the cloud service provider. So when you look at the cloud service providers, the Government of Canada is looking to make it easier for departments to be able to select noteworthy and assured cloud service providers. So they're taking some of the load off organizations by doing an assessment process. So what CCCS does is they look at the materials, the ISO reports, the SOC 2 reports, the FedRAMP reports where available. Canadian cloud providers may not have FedRAMP reports. They'll look at the coverage of the services, and they will do an assessment against their protected B medium profile. And that assessment is available to public sector organizations and as well the federal government departments that use those. It's important when you're looking at those assessment reports. Those assessment reports look at a category of service, be it a platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, and a software as a service. They don't tease out the control plane. They don't tease out the audit plane. And so you as a security practitioner have the ability to tease those out. And you might find that, look, some of the risk items that they identify are actually lower than what the assessment report says. For example, one of the common risks that is identified in the assessment reports is a medium risk of information disclosure by employees. So there's a sense that you could spill data into the cloud by an employee for, let's say, a software as a service application. If you're simply doing software-defined networking, that risk of releasing sensitive data is greatly decreased. And so you can manage those risk settings in that way. The magic for an SA&A process, in my mind, is the concept of operations. This really describes how you're using the services. If you're in the military context, it describes your missions. It describes what you're going to be doing, how you're going to be doing it. And so spend a lot of time on your concept of operations so that you understand how you're actually going to move into the cloud and operate this as part of your overall operations context. And you see the key areas that are there from the templates. Again, concept of ops are broadly shared amongst communities. You heard from the threat risk assessment piece yesterday from JF around the ability to tailor threat risk assessments. Things you might want to consider in the cloud environment is the risk of naughty neighbors or rogue admins. But I'd always encourage you to think about also the investments that cloud service providers make in their security environments, their teams, their global perspective on threats and risks, and their ability to remediate when they see things early. We're fortunate in our time zone that, look, sometimes we see things happening in Europe, and we can catch them before they actually come to North America as cloud service providers. So remember that from your threat risk assessment. Now, this slide I'd like to spend a little bit of time on because I think it's important as we start to think about hyperscale cloud that we start to look at those stepwise changes that are there. One of the things that always pokes me in the eye is when people say cloud is just somebody else's computer. Well, not really, because cloud is operated in different ways. And throughout these this day and a half so far, you've heard from JF, you've heard from Mark, you've heard from Jonathan around, how hyperscale is different, how the physical security is dramatically different, layers of defense, no loan zones, people that are within the data centers have no access to the logical zone. The concept of advanced persistent audit from my colleagues at Trend Micro that had mentioned that is saying, look, at any one day of the year, hyperscale cloud providers have an auditor that's reviewing those controls. Understand that the networks that are being built are largely owned by the cloud providers. When you look at the undersea cables, the majority of investments in undersea cables are from the cloud providers. Data striping across drives, hardware security manuals. Again, looking at the entirety of the controls that are there is critically important. Also important to note is that when you're looking at those audit reports, take time to go outside the checkboxes and look at the system descriptions. Because a lot of times these advanced security controls have been put into that system description because they just don't what can be seen as some dated control frameworks. The documentation, I think Jonathan provided a great deal of insight into the documentation. Remember the service terms, think of the data protection addendums, look at the definitions of data. Often when we see from contractual perspectives that data is treated as Canada's data or Ontario's data or, TD's data. And yet cloud service providers will characterize, sometimes 5, 6 different types of data, be it telemetry data, be it diagnostic data, customer content. So get your head around those addendums. Foundational privacy impact assessments have now become mandatory for Government of Canada contracts. So you have a lot of the work done for PIAs before you. Look for penetration test reports and again, understand the service descriptions. Next comes the security traceability requirements traceability matrix. Now, this is a lot of heavy lifting, and you saw from the charts that JF was showing yesterday, this can be tedious work to take a look across. But what we've found from practitioners in this space is that the SRTMs or the SRCMs, the controls matrix, are being shared by government departments. And so those that have passed through this process prior are sharing those tools so that they can give people a leg up in completing these tool sets. And also recognize that a lot of cloud service providers are creating blueprints, templates, guardrails to assist on the consumer side controls or on your side of the control fabric. As you move forward, the first one is the hardest, but being able to move quickly and in an agile fashion after you've created your initial template is important. And so what you can find is you're able to reuse service patterns that you used in the past. And it's also important to conceptualize some of these services in a different way than what you might have seen in the assessment process. So where you have an infrastructure component, you may be able to describe the risk environment differently. Where you don't store data to disk, if you have, let's say, some service functions or cloud functions, where you're not we're dealing with personal identifiable information. By categorizing those services, you may provide yourself some flexibility as you move forward in your certification practices. And this is just another description to try to provide it graphically. And again, it's intended to really provide the maximum amount of reuse in your existing materials. So you'll find that the service providers will have consistent patterns, right? It doesn't matter what your containerization technology is called. You'll find that, hey, the containerization is done fairly consistent, or your storage is done in a fairly consistent way. And so if you're able to define those service patterns, then you're able to define that reuse. And remember, because we're working with an that can help you then move quickly through subsequent subsequent accreditation processes. So what are some of the hints we've heard from practitioners? Look for consistent services to streamline your accreditation. Avoid simply looking for SKUs. The great thing about cloud services is that there's a ton of innovation happening on a almost weekly basis. And what you'll find is some of the services get refactored, and a lot of the tools will be consumed in consistent ways. And so you might have a storage element that's consumed by a higher order service. Well, you've already done that work for the storage element. And so understand how these tools come together. Understand that compliance coverage isn't security coverage. And so, yes, it's great that you've got your SOC 2 report and all those checklists done. But have you looked at the security environment in your domain? Have you done least privilege of your administrators? Have you segmented the authorizations there? Read the security descriptions. There's a great wealth of information there. Understand that you have a lot of flexibility as a security practitioner, as a department, to make decisions, risk decisions based upon the guidance that's there. And lastly, try to avoid risk transference. Your deputy heads are accountable for security, and as a result, they can make the decision to go forward with their ATO. I apologize for speaking so quickly. I know that Joe's got some fantastic content that he wants to share. So if there's one or two questions, be happy to take them now, or we can lump them all together after Joe's session.
We do have one question from JF. He asks, many of our controls are operational in nature, something like disaster recovery testing, for example. How can we involve our cloud provider in such operational proofs? Is that something that is an additional cost or service level?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something that I think people do need to be aware of the fault resiliency of their cloud provider. Are they across different fault zones, different energy areas? It all boils down to what the service level agreement is between yourself and the cloud service provider to see what that uptime looks like. And then I think when it comes to an engineering perspective, from an infrastructure as a service perspective, you can also then build that resilience into your environment. And so if you have a mission critical application, there's a lot of templates and tools to be able to describe how you allocate that across different fault domains and regions. From a audit perspective, I haven't seen a particular time to recovery type environment, audit request. I think, we've seen this change in mindset from what was a tiering of data centers now to this continuous service delivery assurance. when we look at how the cloud service providers deliver their services, generally they have multiple live solutions in one location, and then they'll have another live solution in another location, so that they're able to move that workload quickly and easily in the guardrails that are provided for regionalization.
Excellent. Thank you so much, John. I don't think we have any other questions at this time, so we'll move on to Joe. So next up, we have Joe Cummings from Cybernetic Q. And Joe, if you want to take over sharing your screen and introduce yourself, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Kelly. John, I feel like it's going on after Elvis right now, so this is some great stuff. Thanks so much. Can everybody hear me? I think I'm active.
Yes, we can. Yep.
Perfect. Excellent. Again, just like Kelly mentioned, founder of Cybernetic here in Canada. I'm also part of the Ryerson University DMZ Catalyst, building out technologies for Canadians by Canadians. I'm not going to belabor the point too much that Jonathan did a great job of presenting today about the service models. For us, all software as a service, SaaS, PaaS, and IaaS are all fairly similar in nature. For us, the way that I perceive it right now is they all have different contexts, implications, and outcomes. And again, not going to be talking too much at a strategic level or a documentation or oversight and compliance piece. For me, it's all about the tactical and more about the operational. So as I look at things right now, each one of those different components has a different piece to play, a different part to play. Those outcomes and those implications allow us to drive that security program forward. Working with some of our larger double XL size customers and some of our bigger teams that are actually working within the three-dimensional space within that multi-dimensional cybersecurity experience, we see that they have divided up the security functions, those various deployment models, and of course the technology stacks that go into them in very different ways. In fact, what I typically describe to most of our community is each one of those different organizations is effectively a snowflake, and to ascribe a certain function or process or trying to be able to jury rig something together doesn't usually work. They need to be done from a grassroots perspective and being mindful of the standards and the overarching compliance piece, whether it is a SOC 2, an ITSD 22, an ISO, or if you're on the control system side from an IESO perspective, ISO or NERC, NIST as well are all common frameworks that are applied. But again, just from a mentality state, each one of them have a different component to play, whether they are a full stack deployment or on-prem. Again, both work very, very well. But when we look at the bigger piece, for us, that right now is the way that I perceive the world, being able to understand on the far left-hand side where that customer sits with an on-prem deployment for a lot of those mission critical, a lot of the security and intelligence community, whether they're here at home or abroad. And then, of course, on the farther end of the spectrum, that cloud service provider, and then the mix of the two of them in between. So again, keeping the mindset right now that you can have a bit of a mix and match. Jonathan did a great job of describing that, and John, you did as well, being able to highlight where that demarcation point is between the customer premise and then the provider themselves, and how much of one and too much of the other, what works best for those practitioners and, of course, those asset owners themselves. That being said, there is a lot of these different layers that we see inside of that environment. Again, from what I've been able to do with our collection of assessment activities and, of course, helping those teams work through their security architecture, as well as the compliance and accreditation pieces. Each layer has a different piece to play, and being able to extract that information, whether it is at a tactical level, being able to pull it down directly from the servers themselves, or actually being able to consolidate that information from third-party vendors or application interfaces, validate that is incredibly vital to the security process, and being able to provide greater depth of field of what the existing architecture might look at, how it might be perceived, if there is any threat indicators, or if there's any vectors that are not being considered, or once fully established. I'm thinking back now to this summer where we saw an entire organization move from an on-prem deployment to the cloud within a span of time that would shock and blow back the hair of most organizations. Being agile enough to be able to make those quick turnarounds, having knowledge of where the stack is and how they're able to extract that information and then move it across from their bare metal infrastructure to being able to put it into a cloud deployment has been incredibly revealing. But again, that data set itself is vital to the security program. You can't do anything without proper data sets itself. Your sensors will be out of whack, and you're going to be making the wrong assumptions based off of your security program and your security scorecard. And that's a great parallel into what we typically see with most organizations from a security perception, whether it is within the identification, protection, detection, response, and mitigation or recovery. Where they see themselves and how they score themselves is always pretty revealing about what the organization looks like, whether or not they have the right hygiene put in place, whether or not they have the right elements of the security fundamentals. We were doing a recent workshop with a very large organization here in Canada, actually a household name, where they themselves are appealing to the security community and asking for ideas and insights about how to do more advanced SA and A activities on their burgeoning cloud deployments as it relates to a retail infrastructure. And it was being able to draw back to CSE standards, to NIST, to some of the other standard documents, and saying, like, it's already been done before. This is not new greenfield opportunities. We have the technologies to do this stuff today. Showing them what that actual layout was allowed them to readjust their security perception on what their current configuration was, and actually work towards what is their reality right now, which was much, much different from what they had originally perceived. So there was a lot of work to be done that way. But again, as a proper coach, and again, I feel that most people on the professional services side of things are effectively there to coach those organizations as opposed to belittle or deprecate them. Helping them augment and rise above is really what we're all about. But that being said, we are taking a lot of information from a lot of security control surface elements, those sensors themselves that have been deployed. This is just a quick spattering of what I've run into in my own space within, I'd say, about 2 years worth of time. I can't work with this type of dashboard. It's very difficult, it's very cumbersome to make an idea of what is actually there at a SOC level tactically, or how it's going to affect the security program as a whole. Very difficult from a compliance perspective when you're trying to feed raw information that is unsanitized and unstructured into a certification accreditation process. I describe it as being round hole, square peg most often, but I've been being able to generate the right pieces of information and distill that is where I see our current challenges right now as a sector and as a community. We have a focus right now, and not wanting to get too far afield, but the device-centric activities that we see right now, and then of course how they all interoperate between the analysts and the threat data that's being generated, where we actually see those tools to test and to evaluate, and then ultimately validating that problem. And then of course how we actually use tools to fix that problem. That complexity is both slow, expensive. It's also very cumbersome to actually do on a regular basis. We need tools right now that can actually help align and be able to draw together that essential vital piece where we actually can overlay all those different components together and see how they all interoperate, as well as being able to apply the lenses that we use to perceive them, identify bottlenecks, address the community to the perimeter, and then of course any trusted third-party sources that go along with it. That to me right now speaks to how we're going to be able to generate the raw data through that threat risk assessment, through that certification accreditation process, to be able to align both the program all the way down to a grassroots level and back and forth from there on out. And again, that's just common knowledge, but again, I feel like it's important to point that out. This is where I feel like we are at the cusp of some great activities right now, and the community is making better use of that data set itself. So that cloud virtuous cycle for us, drawing from the attack surface analysis playbook, pulling together that information, we can actually be able to align things, make better decisions, and actually allow better actions as it continues to evergreen that certification process. But again, being mindful that there is not just simply one way to look at the world. There is, in fact, a plurality of ways that we can perceive it. The way I typically coach our teams is that those three different groups, whether they are operational technologies, IoT, or enterprise and IT, they are not actually separate pillars, where in fact they are actually all part of a larger constellation. This is in fact a deployment of an ecosystem where the center, your crunchy nougat core of what your science or engineering that you're doing or performing rests at the middle. The enterprise layer wraps around that, and then the IoT and beyond also ties in directly as the third or fourth layer, depending on how you perceive things within your own environment. Just for a quick example, this is a typical vendor that we're working with right now that is both FedGov related, but also has a larger agency deployment. They have a plurality of different products that they're using across a number of different layers that are all part of that security framework. Helping them understand what that security controls environment looks like has been part and parcel of what we're all about. How to make better use of that data set itself and actually present them with a, if you can imagine the analogy, if you're one of our military brethren and have come from that space, that attack surface, or in this case, that landscape, where we can actually have more information being generated at each level that exists inside that environment, and then consolidate them together to actually have a clear picture of what that attack path might look like and how it can be applicable to your security program as a whole. Nothing is more enjoyable for me as an operator, but also as a part of this community, than to see those organizations be able to drop in their data sets together, align them, overlay the existing security controls framework, whether they're using the HTRA tome, as John was keen to point out, or if they're using a different standard, and actually seeing how all those things together can sift in and actually drop into the right pieces inside of that framework itself. Just going to talk quickly about what I see as the anatomy of an attack surface analysis platform. And again, that is an assessment tool that we can use to address the how of where we are going to do that SA activity. And again, pulling together 4 different pieces, from enriching that data set, pulling in those real-time feeds, creating that immersive modeling so it's easier to look at and it's not just a series of line after line with no context. And in a lot of ways, be able to overlay right now the machine learning and AI pieces that make it much easier for us as operators or as asset owners to make better sense of the information that we're seeing. And the way I describe that to the teams is actually being able to visualize that attack surface. And again, each layer that is seen within that environment presents a different context of what is actually there. Each different element actually will allow us to address a source of that puzzle, from the terrain itself, the way that we overlay all of the actual demarcation points or all the different segmentation points. Drop in some of the existing endpoint data if you have that, and the ability to see the differentiation between those different terrains, and then ultimately be able to identify high sensitivity areas, be able to perform segmentation and standoff where necessary, and of course allow us to understand and be able to perceive the proximity to exposure and the proximity and prioritization of those devices that might require additional care or additional standoff or additional security controls, because they are vital to the organization's mission. And again, just trying to frame that up by itself is not necessarily the easiest of things, especially when you have a number of different solutions and a number of different deployments inside the organization. For us, we start off with packet traffic. We try to overlay in the firewall configurations to identify segmentation. We wrap it up again with a little bit of the vulnerability feeds to identify that heat bloom vulnerabilities inside the network, tie together some SIMs, some logging to be able to explore the trends over time within that fourth dimension. And then, of course, allow in that indicator of compromise. Again, that's so vital, especially when you're working with the larger organizations within the CCSE or within CSE and beyond. Then allow in that third-party cloud source. They have an incredible wealth of knowledge, especially with the sources of IOCs internally themselves, being able to harness that information together to consolidate that data lake for the organization. Just pulls everything together, makes complete sense of what's actually going on. And that allows us to make a more consolidated path together for that resilience infrastructure. And again, has been part and parcel of what we've seen so far with the assessments that we've worked on to date. Drawing off of about 200 or so, the vast majority had some form of cloud deployment. That was the crux of what their cybersecurity infrastructure relied on from an always-on perspective. But now being able to tie that all the way through their certification, accreditation, and evergreening those as they continue to go through those processes. Much easier to do. And again, from a methodology perspective, I'll leave you with this last thought. We can allow the operators, the people who are responsible, and again, teams, tradecraft, and technology, being able to rely on the teams to go out and perform these types of activities where they can actually be able to apply such methodologies for their reporting, to be able to track on security controls, and to be able to share that information either laterally, east-west in the organization, or of course, present that further upstream to shareholders, stakeholders, and beyond, whether or not you're presenting to someone who might have ministerial relation. That way we have clear view on all of the different sections within our teams. And then, of course, being able to combine that information together to make better sense of what our cybersecurity posture is. And again, nothing is more enjoyable for me, especially as a Canadian operator, to take this conversation down to the States where we've seen it be readily consumed, especially when those teams themselves are processed, and then kind of come full circle right now and being able to share that with you guys today as part of this AFCEA presentation. Really appreciate this. I'll leave you with a quick little blast on my contact information, which apparently is now blanked out, but would love to have your feedback and perhaps even questions.
Oh, we can still see your, oh no, I guess because it's the gray on gray. Well, that's okay. I've shared contact information on the final slide as well. So John, do we have a few questions for Joe?
We do have a couple questions that popped in. Let's start off with how do you see quantum threats eventually playing against cloud infrastructures?
Oh man, how long do we have? We only have a couple more minutes left. Eh? Quantum threats, lots of great activities happening right now around that here in Canada. I'm very well aware of what we're seeing right now, especially with the US Navy and the US DoD with their current quantum deployments. Great tool to take a peek at is Crypto 4A. Those are peers of mine inside of the Catalyst. They're doing a lot of great work in that space, but from an attack perspective, it's going to become, it's going to blow the doors off of things pretty quickly, yeah.
So just an add-on to that, Joe, the Crypto 4A people are doing some great things. Entropy as a service is absolutely brilliant. And many of us still know Bruno Couillard from days gone by. So it's great news there, well known by the community. Another activity that's underway under ISED, Innovation, Science, Economic Development, is the newly formed Canadian Forum for Digital Infrastructure Resilience. I happen to be industry co-chair of that group, and we have Michele Mosca that's leading a working group that's looking at quantum resilience across the Canadian ecosystem. And he started some work with the banks around how do you do measurement of quantum readiness. And so that's a piece of work to watch there as well.
Absolutely, for sure.
Another question that came up is, in the US, they're experiencing challenges getting smaller, innovative companies offering small, innovative offerings accredited. Similarly, in Canada, our small, innovative APIs providers and secondary SaaS providers will struggle making the necessary investment to obtain accreditation. What can be done or what is being done to support Canadian innovators to be part of the GC cloud ecosystems?
That's a great question. I know firsthand the difficulties that Canadian startups and Canadian the ecosystem here at home has faced, having been a three-time founder. Just being part of the conversation has been difficult, especially because of our size. What we have found is that when we work as a community, so again, being part of a larger ecosystem, working in concert with our peers has been part of the solution. I know myself, because of my relationship with public safety and defense research, it's been easier. But for some other teams, it's been much more difficult. The other half of that is becoming part of the procurement process has allowed us to open up that, and that goes to a credit to the CSPV process right now that is being run by PSPC and shared services. It has allowed us to kind of leapfrog ourselves in terms of our size and caliber. Granted, we are all defense community. We've been able to see that there is an easier path forward, especially to do that certification and that accreditation ourselves. And again, working with other practitioners, it's been made much easier. In the States, they have a similar challenge. That's why they work with different catalyst groups. There's one in Austin, San Francisco, another one in Augusta, Georgia, and then another one that I'm aware of in the DC area, where I'm typically hopping back and forth between Toronto. Big challenge for them down south is the accreditation process is so much larger, and it is a different structure where it is typically privatized. So again, it's a much more pay-to-play process, which is very different.
That great insight, Joe. And certainly, if I were to add to that, what we've seen from the SaaS and PaaS providers in Canada is that there's an unfamiliarity with kind of that shared responsibility. So now you've added a third party into that shared responsibility, and you really have to wrap your head around, if I have an app that I'm simply loading into a virtual machine, do I need necessarily a SOC 2 audit report for that app? Well, probably not. You probably need a ISO quality management or security development lifecycle, because you're not having third-party admins. You're not setting up the audit. Like, that's all on you as the organization that's consuming that packaged software. If you have a customization, that might be something different. If you have somebody that's actually operating that third-party service, well, that's where you start to look at inheritance. Right. So if you have a SaaS application, you can inherit all those controls from the underlying infrastructure. And so having a FedRAMP report or something of the sort, which is by far the most detailed description of controls, allows you then to allocate a lot of that work to that other provider. But quite frankly, the work needs to be done. If you're selling a secured application, you need to have that assurance, demonstrate that assurance.
Yeah, 100%.
Another question, given that everyone knows the evaluation criteria, the controls catalog, can cloud providers describe their services along with a matrix of controls that are provided and supported?
That sounds to me like, well, there's a lot of anecdotes there, but John, this sounds to me more of a question for you.
Well, all right. So I would argue that we do, right? So we do provide that indication of the controls that are there. So if you look at the FedRAMP system security plans that you can get from the hyperscale cloud providers, some publish them externally, some you have to get them on request, but they go through each of the 465 controls in glory. It's glorious detail. It's the last one I looked at, 760 pages of control description. And so you'll really want to flex your bigger monitor when you're going through that. And it's described there. And given the tight alignment with the CCCS controls, right, they simply use the third-party auditing organization's review of that. Now, I think there are those 12 additional controls that are listed by the CCCS environment, and that's where the assessment process or their accreditation comes in.
Yeah, just don't operate heavy machinery while reading that.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
Awesome. I think that pretty much wraps up the questions from what I can see.
Yeah, I don't see any others. Anybody have any last questions before we wrap? All right. Thank you so much, Joe, John, and Jonathan for today. That was a wonderful collection of information, and I think everyone's got a basis now between yesterday and today. Thank you, JF and Mark, for yesterday. Between the foundations of SA and the obligations and compliance issues and shared responsibility challenges with the cloud for SA or SA for the cloud. Let me just share my screen. Here we go. So just a thank you to all of the corporate members who participated, and these are all additional corporate members that you can go to for any of your questions around cloud. And I encourage you to join as an individual member to AFCEA. We're always looking for more members, and happy to have folks pitch in, volunteer for events, or simply come and attend the events and soak up all the great information. So tomorrow is our last day of the 3-day session, and tomorrow we've got the practitioners from CMHC, ESDC, and TBS. So we look forward to seeing many of you there tomorrow. And there's still time for any of your colleagues to register for tomorrow if you want to share the link or invite with them. So, John, anything you want to say in conclusion today?
No, thank you, Kelly. You summed it up. We have a fantastic panel tomorrow with, I think you'll find some great enlightenment around their approach to this. We have an early adopter, a department that's gone fully into the cloud, and then a practitioner that has worked through SA&A in a crisis and to talk about how that works. And so I think you'll find their perspective very, very helpful as you go through your SA&A practices.
Wonderful. And as we said, this was recorded, so we will be sharing it with everyone who registered today. Thank you, everybody. Have a fabulous day.
Thank you. You too.